Chapter 10. The Essence of Fascism, the Organized Expression of Social Decay. Fascism, developing since little over a decade, has no long past behind it, and in all probability, from the very nature of its reactionary role, from its violent inner contradictions, and from the whole character of its desperate attempt to throw up a dam against the advancing social revolution, is likely to have no long future before it. Fascism is likely to be remembered only as an episode in the long-drawn class war advancing to the final victory of the socialist revolution. But if fascism were able to have the opportunity to continue over a longer period, were able to maintain its power and to dominate as it dreams a whole phase of social history, then it is evident from the whole foregoing analysis what its historical role would be, and what kind of society it would produce. Fascism claims to bring rejuvenation to the existing declining society, to represent the principle of new birth and new life in place of the existing decay, to represent the principle of organization and order in place of the existing capitalist anarchy. The exact contrary is the case. Because the roots of the existing decay and anarchy lie in the capitalist class ownership of the means of production, the only new life and new birth can come from the victory of the proletariat and the socialist reorganization of society. This has been demonstrated on a world historic scale by the Soviet Union, where alone triumphant advance in every sphere of human activity and culture confronts the increasing decay and barbarism of the fascist world, equally in the fascist and in the non-fascist countries. What fascism organizes and carries forward is in reality nothing other than the process of increasing decay and barbarism of the capitalist world in the culminating stage of the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary and chauvinist elements of finance capital. Fascism endeavors violently to suppress and overcome the ever-growing contradictions of capitalist society. As Goering stated in a speech to the Pomeranian Landbund on March 17, 1933, quote, "The regime of national concentration will with iron fist bring the opposing interests of the different strata of society into that harmony which is so essential for the prosperity of the German people." Unquote. Forcible, or iron fist, suppression of the opposing interests of the different strata of society into harmony. That is to say, in short, iron fist harmony. That is the essence of fascism. Comment: violent peace, or unjust peace, a stagnant peace predicated on a police state, trying to achieve the unachievable, or using extra force to jam that square peg into that round hole. Continuing, but what does this involve? For in fact, just the contradictions and consequent conflicts are the mainspring and driving force of social development in class society. That is to say, until society becomes a true collective by the liquidation of classes. Until then, the path of class conflict is the path of social development, to attempt on the one hand to maintain the contradictions unresolved, and on the other to suppress forcibly their expression, would mean, even if it could be imagined as successful, that society would cease to develop and would pass, on the most favorable hypothesis, to a Byzantine or Old Chinese hieratic ossification. But such a society requires, in fact, an entirely different economy from capitalism. In reality, the driving force of the laws of finance capital, which govern fascism, leads necessarily to an entirely different outcome, to an intensification of all contradictions, both internal and external, to the point of explosion. Just by its attempt to suppress forcibly, in place of resolving the contradictions of modern society, fascism reveals most profoundly its reactionary role. First, fascism seeks to suppress the class struggle, not by the abolition of classes, but by the violent, permanent subjection of the exploited class to the exploiters, and the crushing of all resistance. This means, even if it could be, for a period successful, a condition of permanent inner war within society, with consequent extreme waste of social forces and increasing destruction of all possibility of collective achievement. Its stabilization would mean the replacement of liberal capitalism by a caste or statutory servile system. As the 19th century liberal capitalist system of formal, free contract increasingly disappears under modern conditions of large-scale industry, its breakdown raises ever more sharply the two immediate alternatives: either socialism, that is, the common ownership of the means of production and common obligation of all citizens to labor and sharing of the fruits, or the servile state, state capitalism, that is, the statutory compulsion and regulation of the labor of the wage-earning class for the profit of the property-owning class under a general framework of state control with the abolition of the right to strike. The fascist state represents the second alternative, that is, the servile state. Second, fascism seeks to suppress and overcome the contradictions of capitalist economy brought about by the advance of technique and the development of mass production and productive power. As before, it seeks not to resolve the contradictions in the higher form of socialization, the already social forms of production, but to overcome them within the limits of the fettering capitalist relations. This can only mean in practice, however, either to endeavor to restrict artificially the productive forces, throttling down production to fixed limits suitable to monopolist capital, checking new development, and clamping on state bureaucratic control for the purposes of this limitation, or in the final analysis, since such limitation is finally incompatible with the requirements of the expansion of capital, to move to the only alternative and endeavor to blast by violence a way out from the impasse. That is, to endeavor by war to secure a new division of the world and an enlarged outlet for the one particular finance capitalist bloc at the expense of its rivals. Comment: we talked in the previous chapter about how libertarianism today, very much a crypto-fascist movement, it will take anti-war stands publicly and also anti-police state stands publicly. However, the private property basis of the system in an advanced capitalist world cannot but have a police state and war for the reasons just explained above. Continuing, third, and in consequence of the above, fascism necessarily leads to war on an extending scale. Fascism already enormously carries forward the process of shattering the basis of international economy and of the international division of labor built up in the previous period, and moves instead to the line of organization of closed-in, isolationist economic blocs, the line of so-called national self-sufficiency or autarky, which is in fact only the preparation for intensified war for the world market. Comment: what is going on today with the retreat of all of these right-wing governments into national isolationism? And this is exactly what's happening. Continuing, this openly retrograde line means the cutting down of international trade and communications, the raising of the costs of production, the lowering of the standard of living, and the increasing balkanization of the capitalist world. In its final working out, the intensified economic war necessarily leads to open armed struggle. War becomes the open, avowed, and glorified aim of every fascist society. Fascism reveals itself more and more in every aspect of its policy as organization and mobilization of the entire economy, political structure, and population as a whole for war. This sharply expresses the profoundly reactionary role of fascism, which in this way directs its main organization, even where it appears to carry forward the highest organization and technical development for destruction, objectively hastening forward the decline and decay of capitalism. Just this demonstrates the significance of the role of fascism as the typical system of organization of capitalism in extreme decay, seeking to overcome the decay and contradictions by intensified organization and strengthening of the capitalist dictatorship, but in fact only able to lead by its very organization to intensified contradictions, war, and the acceleration of capitalist decay. Thus, fascism, so far from representing a counterforce to the process of decay of existing capitalist society, is in reality the sharpest expression and an accelerating factor of the whole process of capitalist decay, of increasing destruction and the drive to barbarism. This is the reality of the, quote, alternative which fascism offers to socialism. The sense of the decline of civilization, the overpowering atmosphere of pessimism, even though accompanied by formal expressions of hope of revival through fascism, overwhelmingly dominates all fascist expression and betrays its innermost essence. Quoting Mussolini, January 1922, "We have no belief in programs or plans, in saints or apostles. Above all, we have no belief in happiness, in salvation, or in the promised land." Unquote. If you have no belief in happiness, literally what is the point of living? Quoting Mussolini again in The Political and Social Doctrine of Fascism, "Fascism denies the materialist conception of happiness as a possibility." Unquote. Quoting the Popolo d'Italia, 1920, "In the gloom of today and the darkness of tomorrow, the only faith that remains to us individualists destined to die is the at present absurd but ever consoling religion of anarchy." Unquote. Sounds like you could have taken that from today's Black Pillars. And quoting Black Shirt magazine, 1933, "Hopeless we may be, yet we have the hope of doomed men." Unquote. Quoting Fascist Week, an actual magazine, 1934, fully aware of the declines of cultures and civilizations before us, we still demand the right of every proud warrior to fight for a cause, though that cause seems lost, unquote. But it is not a lost cause. Such is the hasty addition appended, without attempt at grounds other than a mystic faith, to the last quotation, to save appearances and justify the fascist fight. But the addition rather confirms than changes the basic outlook revealed. The basic tone and outlook remains that of a dying civilization fighting against odds to continue defiantly in the face of all of the evidence of the doom of history proclaimed against it. So comment, in other words, capitalism is dying, fucking deal with it, stop trying to murder people because you're mad about it. It's not the end of everything, we're actually going to move on to something much better than this. At least for about 99% of the population, probably including you. Continuing, characteristic of this whole outlook is the dominating influence of Spengler on fascism, the favorite, the most quoted, and the dominating philosopher and teacher of the fascist, quote, theorists, remains Spengler, the shallow journalistic smatterer philosopher of the inevitability of decline and of the collapse of civilization, even though his conclusions are so downright black and hopeless in their pessimism that they are compelled formally to deny them while accepting his premises. The recent official book of British fascism, Drennan's Sir Oswald Mosley and British Fascism, fills its pages with endless excerpts from Spengler declaring, quote, Spengler's interpretation of world history is a colossal monument to the European mind. His interpretation of past history remains valid and constitutes a base from which modern man may begin to interpret his own present and to modify his own future, unquote. What is the teaching of this, quote, colossal prophet? He writes, quote, only dreamers believe that there is a way out. Optimism is cowardice. We are born into this time and must bravely follow the path to the destined end. There is no other way. I'll tell that to Hitler, I guess. Our duty is to hold on to the last position, without hope, without rescue. The honorable end is the one thing that cannot be taken from a man. Unquote. What is the comment of the fascist week on all this commonplace maudling posturing of all dying civilizations? Quote, his words are a magnificent example of dauntless nobility in the face of inevitable annihilation. Unquote. The fascist organ thereafter endeavors to plead that perhaps man may be, quote, in some ways free of natural laws, and thus escape the doom. But even the final conclusion of the fascist organ runs, quote, for those who make the choice, the very least of their destinies will be an honorable end, unquote. In the same way, the official book on Mosley and British fascism, already quoted, glories in the breakdown of civilization and the return to the primitive, quote, the powers of the blood, unbroken bodily forces resume their ancient lordship. Out of the night of history, this is like so ridiculous, old shadows are appearing which menace their complacency. Sir Herbert Samuel, a liberal of singular perspicacity, believes that Europe is returning to the conditions of the 12th century. Professor Lasky wails against these new men who have, quote, no inhibitions. The figure of the leader comes out into the stark day, in the grim serenity of Mussolini, in the harsh force of Hitler, and behind them stride the eternal condottieri, the gallant, vivid Balbo, the ruthless Goering, unquote. With this typical glorification of the condottieri, of the return of the brigand Balbo and the guerrilla Goering, of the law of the jungle, we may leave the fascists to their Neronian pleasures, until such time as the strong hand of the proletarian dictatorship shall end their blood orgies and establish civilized order and progress throughout the world. What speaks here through the mouth of the fascists is nothing but the typical, decadent, parasitic glorification of blood and the caveman, already visible in its first signs in the invalids Nietzsche, Carlyle, and other sick types, or later represented in the Ethel M. Dells and Hemingways of literature. Fascism in its ideology is nothing but the continuation of end-of-century decadence into its necessary outcome in bloodlust and barbarism. All this is only the death rattle of the dying bourgeois civilization. Against all this pessimism, decline, decay, and filth, tragic destinies, self-heroizings, idolization of death, returns to the primitive, mysticism, spiritualism, and corruption, the revolutionary proletarian movement of communism, of Marxism, the heir of the future, proclaims its unshakable certainty and confidence in life, in science, in the power of science, in the possibility of happiness, proclaims its unconquerable optimism for the whole future of humanity, and in this sign, armed with the weapons of scientific understanding, of dialectical materialism, of Marxism, will conquer and sweep from the earth the dregs of disease and decay which find their expression in fascism. The threat of world war. The experience of both Italian fascism and German fascism, as also of the military fascism of Japan, has overwhelmingly demonstrated that fascism drives toward war. Italian fascism, after concentrating its entire organization and economy on preparation for war, led the way as the first of the European powers to open large-scale war in the new period since the world crisis by its attack on Ethiopia in 1935. The open and cynical character of this aggression on a people technically backward and deprived of arms by the action of the imperialist powers, and the no less contemptuous disregard of all the professions of the Kellogg Pact and of the League of Nations Covenant, aroused universal awakening to the true character of fascism as the instigator of war. The Ethiopian adventure of the Italian fascists was declared by their friend and admirer, Churchill, to be a, quote, deadly trap. But in fact, this whole policy, the growing crisis of their economy, as well as the inner weakening of the regime, could find no other outcome. The advance of Italian fascism to war was continuously predicted by Mussolini, and even dated by him for 1935, in his speeches as far back as 1927. In this respect, and in this respect alone, the event has fully borne out the proposals of fascism. Nice, a little dig at the hypocrisy of fascism. That's the one thing they actually delivered on. The experience of German fascism, though shorter, is of even more far-reaching significance. In the case of German fascism, it is manifest to all observers, and it is unnecessary to recapitulate the detailed evidence, given, for example, with ample documentation in Dorothy Woodman's Hitler Rearms, that the entire organization, not only of technique and economy, but of the whole life of the people, has been directed to war on a scale that has never before been equaled. Behind Hitler stands the General Staff. The estimate, given currency by Churchill in 1935, that the expenditure of Germany on war preparation has attained the colossal figure of £800 million annually, a sum exceeding the total figure of the British budget, reveals not only the extreme degree which this process has reached, but also the extreme instability of its whole basis and the impossibility of continuing this process for any prolonged period without reaching the final outcome in war. These tendencies of extreme and heavy rearmament and of the increasing mobilization of the whole population and economy for war are not confined to the fascist countries. In greater or less degree, they are common to all the imperialist countries, but they are carried to an extreme point without parallel elsewhere in the fascist countries. The fascist dictatorship provides the means for this enormous compulsory mobilization and regimentation in a way that arouses the envy of the statesmen of the parliamentary democratic countries. Where, however, does this process lead? It is manifest that there can be here no question of stability. On the contrary, the artificial stimulus to economic life through this process of rearmament, which leads to the illusory picture of a short-term revival through fascism, compels a constant acceleration and a continually greater economic instability. On the one side, the pyramid of long-term and short-term debt for unproductive expenditure rises steadily higher. On the other side, the sacrifices and privations imposed on the population, both through the myriad forms of heavy taxation to meet the rising demands of state expenditure, and through the restrictions and cutting off of normal foreign sources of supply, as well as the limitation of home sources of supply for the purpose of war needs and war stocks, lead to a situation in which the population is reduced to the level of extreme wartime conditions and virtual blockade already before the outbreak of war. Thus a situation is reached which received its most typical expression in respect of Japan, when the Times Tokyo correspondent had occasion to declare that if the war industries were for a moment interrupted, the whole economic structure would collapse. Comment, I just keep thinking about the United States. Continuing, such an artificial position belongs to the conditions of wartime, but not of peacetime. It is obvious that such a process as is going forward in Germany cannot long continue in conditions of peace. It must inevitably, in a relatively short period of time, lead to its outcome in war, as the only alternative to its own inner collapse. This becomes more and more evidently the whole direction of German policy, just as Italian policy has already reached this outcome. But the gamble of war, in fact, eventually sharpens all the contradictions and inner weakness of the whole regime. the process of capitalist decay reaches its most extreme and violent expression in fascism.